Amid the rushing crowds and the cold, echoing airport announcements, a former Navy SEAL named Ryan Walker was simply trying to make his way home after years of service. At his side walked Max, a battle-tested K-9 who had once survived war alongside him. As they passed the lost luggage area, Max suddenly froze. Low, growl, tight leash, his instincts locked onto an old, dirt-stained suitcase. Ryan slowed, listening. From inside, barely audible beneath the noise of the terminal, came something chilling. A faint, uneven breath. In that instant, the soldier inside him awakened. This wasn't random. Something was terribly wrong. Subscribe to the channel to witness what happens next and discover how one moment of attention can change a life forever. Winter pressed gently against Denver International Airport, a pale morning of steel-colored clouds and dry mountain cold, the kind that sharpened breath and memory alike. Ryan Walker moved through the terminal with the steady gait of a man who had learned long ago not to rush even when the world around him did. At 38, Ryan carried the unmistakable build of a former Navy SEAL. Broad shoulders slightly hunched as if still bracing for recoil, arms roped with old muscle hands, scarred in quiet places that told stories he rarely shared. His face was angular jaw, set hard beneath a neatly trimmed dark beard, dusted with early gray, a mark left by years that had not been kind but had been honest. His eyes, a muted blue, scanned spaces automatically, not out of fear, but habit crowds exits reflections in glass because the past had trained him to notice what others ignored. Walking at his left side was Max, a retired K-9 Belgian Malinois, nearly 9 years old, coat, tawny with a black mask that made his amber eyes seem permanently alert. Max moved with a softened dignity, now hips slower, but mind razor-sharp, a dog whose loyalty had been earned in gunfire and silence, and whose presence kept Ryan anchored to something solid when memories tried to drift him back into darker water. Ryan was returning home from a quiet contract job, one of the last favors he still did for people who spoke in low voices and never asked for details. Airports always unsettled him. Too many people, too much noise pretending to be order, yet he tolerated them because movement meant purpose, and purpose kept the ghosts at bay. As they passed the baggage claim area reserved for lost and delayed luggage, Max slowed. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring, body stiffening in a way Ryan had not seen since their final deployment together. Ryan felt it before he understood it, the faint tightening in his chest, the subtle pull on the leash. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, his voice calm, the same tone he had used under mortar fire, but Max did not obey. The dog veered toward a row of unattended suitcases, battered shells of travel marked by stickers and dust. One suitcase in particular, an old navy blue hard case with a cracked wheel and a frayed luggage tag, seemed to draw Max like gravity. He lowered his head and let out a low, vibrating whine, a sound so restrained it was almost respectful, as if he were afraid of being wrong. Ryan knelt, boots creaking softly against the tile, and studied the case. Nothing about it screamed danger, yet something felt deeply misplaced, like a wrong note in a familiar song. He pressed his palm against the shell. It was warm, too warm. Beneath the constant hum of conveyor belts and distant announcements, he thought he heard it, a faint, irregular sound, not quite a cry, not quite a breath, but something alive, struggling to remain quiet. Ryan's heart kicked hard against his ribs, memories of sealed rooms and suffocating silence flashing uninvited through his mind. He waved down the nearest airport employee, a woman in her early 30s named Emily Carter, tall and slender with sandy blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail and a tired professionalism in her green eyes. Emily approached cautiously, eyes flicking from Max's tense posture to Ryan's expression, and asked what seemed to be the problem. Ryan explained in short, measured sentences, careful not to alarm but unable to soften the urgency in his voice. Emily hesitated only a moment before calling airport security. Officer Daniel Brooks arrived first, a broad-chested man in his mid-40s, with dark skin, a shaved head, and a calm authority that came from years of routine emergencies. He crouched beside Ryan, listened, then nodded slowly as if confirming something he already suspected. When security cleared the immediate area, Ryan found his hands trembling despite himself. He hated how certain situations stripped away years of control and left him feeling like the younger man he had once been, kneeling beside sealed crates in foreign deserts. Max pressed closer, his flank warm against Ryan's leg, grounding him. As Officer Brooks authorized the suitcase to be opened, Ryan braced himself, unsure whether he was about to witness a tragedy or prevent one, knowing only that whatever lay inside that battered shell would change the quiet trajectory of his return home. Because some calls were not chosen, they were answered. The suitcase opened with a brittle click that sounded far too loud in the suddenly hushed corner of the terminal, as if the airport itself were holding its breath. Ryan Walker leaned forward without realizing he had moved his shoulders. Tense jaw locked, the old discipline of crisis snapping into place. Inside the scuffed blue shell lay a tangle of fabric and fear, and then the smallest movement, a tremor that confirmed what Max had known all along. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 10 weeks old, curled tightly against the hard plastic ribs, fluttering beneath thin fur eyes, glazed with exhaustion. The pup's coat was a muted sable, still soft with youth, its ears half lifted in that uncertain way of a body not yet finished deciding what it would become. A smell of stale air and panic rose up, and Ryan felt something twist painfully in his chest. He had seen men survive worse, and he had seen men break under less. But there was something about the helpless precision of cruelty here that struck deeper than violence ever had. Max lowered his head immediately, tail still, posture respectful as if approaching a wounded soldier. The puppy stirred a faint whimper escaping its throat, and Max answered with a soft huff, a sound he had once used to steady Ryan during long nights when sleep refused to come. Ryan's hands moved without thought, carefully lifting the puppy, supporting its belly, feeling how light it was, too light. The puppy's body was warm in the wrong way, overheated and dehydrated, and Ryan's pulse quickened. Officer Daniel Brooks, steady as granite beside him, murmured instructions into his radio, his voice low and controlled. Brooks had seen enough in his years of airport security to recognize a line that should never be crossed, and the set of his mouth told Ryan this would not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. A small crowd had gathered despite the cordon faces drawn with concern and disbelief. Emily Carter stood a few steps back now, one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes shining, her professional composure cracked but not broken. She moved quickly when Brooks asked for water and a blanket, returning with supplies, as if purpose might shield her from the reality of what she had just witnessed. Ryan wrapped the puppy gently, feeling its heartbeat flutter like a trapped bird. He spoke quietly, not words meant to be understood, just sound meant to reassure, because sometimes tone mattered more than language. Airport medical staff arrived within minutes, led by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian contracted on call for animal transport emergencies. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and athletic, with sun-warmed skin and chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid that spoke of long days and little patience for vanity. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, softened by a kind of practiced empathy that came from years of healing creatures who could not explain their pain. She knelt immediately, assessing the puppy with quick, precise movements, fingers gentle but certain. "He's alive," she said, voice calm, grounding, "but he's been without air circulation longer than is safe. Dehydrated, shocked. We need to move." Ryan felt a strange resistance at the thought of letting go, an irrational fear that the moment the puppy left his arms, something irreversible would happen. Sarah noticed and met his gaze, her expression steady. "You did the right thing," she said, not as reassurance but as fact. It loosened something in him. He nodded and allowed her to take the puppy, watching closely, as if vigilance alone could protect it. Max stayed at Ryan's side, eyes tracking every movement, a silent sentinel. As they moved toward the service corridor leading to the emergency vehicle, Brooks informed Ryan that the suitcase had been traced to a passenger named Thomas Reed, a man already flagged in the system for prior animal transport violations. The name meant nothing to Ryan, but the pattern did. People like Reed rarely thought of consequences beyond convenience, rarely imagined the weight of what they left behind. Ryan's mouth tightened. He had spent years confronting enemies who announced themselves clearly. This kind of cowardice unsettled him more. The puppy let out a weak sound as the stretcher rolled forward, and Ryan followed without hesitation. He knew then that whatever plane he had intended to board no longer mattered. Some missions didn't come with orders or end dates. Some began the moment you recognized a life that needed you. As the doors closed behind them and the noise of the terminal faded, Ryan felt the familiar shift inside the quiet alignment of purpose. Not duty to a flag or command, but to something smaller, more fragile, and somehow heavier. And as Max walked beside him, tail finally lifting just slightly, Ryan understood that this rescue was only beginning. The emergency veterinary clinic sat just beyond the airport perimeter, a low concrete building humming with fluorescent resolve where the air smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Snow had begun to fall again, thin and deliberate, brushing the world as if to soften what could not be undone. Ryan Walker stood just inside the treatment room doorway, hands clasped behind his back posture, rigid in a way that betrayed the battle between discipline and helplessness. Max lay at his feet, chin on his paws, amber eyes fixed on the small form now resting beneath warm lights. The German Shepherd puppy, still unnamed, was connected to thin lines and sensors, chest rising in shallow, uneven rhythms that made time feel fragile. Dr. Sarah Mitchell moved with practiced efficiency, her tall frame bending easily as she adjusted an IV line. Beneath her calm exterior lived a quiet intensity shaped by years of late-night emergencies and impossible choices. She spoke sparingly, but when she did, her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to be steady when others fell apart. Beside her worked Jake Moreno, a veterinary technician in his late 20s, lean and quick with dark curls escaping from beneath his surgical cap and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when concentrating. Jake had grown up rescuing strays with his mother in New Mexico, and it showed in the gentleness of his hands and the way he murmured encouragement to animals who could barely hear him. The next hour matters, Sarah said quietly, eyes never leaving the monitor. He's fighting, but he's exhausted. Ryan nodded, though the words felt insufficient against the weight pressing down on his chest. He had faced countdowns before breaching doors, incoming fire, but those clocks had been loud, obvious. This one ticked silently, measured in heartbeats and breath. Max shifted, lifting his head when the puppy let out a faint, broken sound. Ryan knelt, automatically resting a hand against Max's shoulder, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of fur and muscle. A knock interrupted the moment. Detective Laura Bennett stepped into the room, her presence precise and unobtrusive. In her early 40s, Laura had a sharp, angular face, softened by thoughtful hazel eyes, her auburn hair cut into a practical bob that framed a no-nonsense demeanor. Years in major crimes had given her patience and an ability to listen without rushing to judgment. She introduced herself, briefly explaining that Thomas Reed had been detained at the airport. "He's not talking much," she said, "but his record speaks for him." Ryan felt a flicker of anger rise hot and sudden, then recede into something colder. He had learned long ago that rage without direction was a luxury. Laura glanced at the puppy, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "We'll need a statement eventually," she added, softer now. Ryan met her gaze and nodded. He would say whatever was required, but his attention kept pulling back to the fragile life on the table. Sarah noticed. "You can stay," she said, not unkindly. "He responds to calm presence. Animals know when someone's watching over them." The permission felt heavier than it sounded. Minutes stretched. Jake adjusted a warming blanket. The puppy's breathing steadied just slightly enough to make Sarah's shoulders ease. "That's good," she murmured. "That's very good." Ryan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. In that small victory, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope not tied to outcome, but to effort. He realized how long it had been since he'd allowed himself that. Laura took Ryan aside near the window where the falling snow blurred the world into shades of gray. She asked about Max, about Ryan's service, her questions respectful, unhurried. Ryan answered honestly, explaining how Max had once alerted him to a hidden explosive that saved 3 lives. Laura listened, absorbing the history without comment. "Seems like he hasn't stopped saving lives," she said quietly. The observation landed deeper than she could have known. Back in the room, Sarah finally straightened. "He's stable enough to rest," she announced. "The danger isn't over, but he has a chance now." Ryan closed his eyes briefly, gratitude washing through him. Not relief exactly, but permission to continue believing this mattered. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything, and the puppy's eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused. For a moment they locked onto Ryan's face, and something passed between them. Recognition without memory, trust without reason. As Max rose and padded closer, tail moving once, slow and deliberate, Ryan understood that survival was not the end of this story. It was the opening. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and persistent, as if the world itself were waiting to see what they would do next. Morning arrived quietly at the clinic, not with sunlight, but with the softer language of survival. Steady monitors, warmer air, and the faint scent of coffee drifting in from the front desk. Ryan Walker sat in the same chair he had occupied all night, spine straight, despite the fatigue pulling at his shoulders. Sleep had come in fragments, brief and shallow, interrupted by the rise and fall of a small chest across the room. Max lay stretched beside him, gray, beginning to show around his muzzle, one ear tilted toward the treatment table, never fully resting. The German Shepherd puppy, now cleaned, wrapped and breathing on his own, had been moved to a recovery kennel with clear sides, so no one had to imagine how he was doing. His coat, once dull with fear, showed hints of rich sable beneath the clinic lights, and his ears twitched occasionally as if learning again how to listen to the world. Sarah Mitchell entered with a quiet confidence. Her long stride, unhurried braid loosened slightly from a long night's work. She reviewed the chart, then allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "He made it through the night," she said, voice low but firm. "Dehydration's under control. Lungs are clearer. He's stronger than he looks." Ryan nodded, gratitude settling into him slowly like warmth returning to numb hands. He realized then how tightly he had been holding himself together, as if letting go might undo everything. Later that morning, Detective Laura Bennett returned, coat dusted with melting snow, a folder tucked under her arm. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned to deliver difficult truths without theatrics. She explained that Thomas Reed had confessed quickly, once confronted with evidence, prior violation surveillance footage, the airline manifest. He saw animals as cargo. Laura said, her mouth tightening. Interchangeable. Disposable. Ryan absorbed the words in silence. He had known men like that in other contexts, people who reduced life to utility. It had never ended well. Paperwork followed, form signatures, procedural language that tried to make chaos orderly. Sarah explained that the puppy would need several weeks of monitoring before being cleared for adoption. Ryan listened, nodding, but a realization had already taken root. When Sarah finally looked up from the chart and met his eyes, she seemed to read it there. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently, "but he'll need consistency. Familiar voices help recovery." Ryan glanced at Max, who had risen and now stood quietly near the kennel tail, still eyes soft. "He already has that," Ryan replied, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. A volunteer arrived in the afternoon, a woman named Helen Moore, late 60s, petite, with silver hair pulled into a low bun, and hands that moved carefully as if every gesture were considered. Helen had spent years fostering abandoned dogs after losing her husband, grief reshaping her life into something quieter but purposeful. She spoke softly to the puppy, while changing bedding, her presence calm and unassuming. The puppy watched her with cautious curiosity, then turned his head toward Ryan when he spoke, as if mapping where safety lived. By evening, the puppy was allowed brief contact outside the kennel. Ryan knelt slowly, mindful not to overwhelm him. The puppy's legs trembled as he stepped forward, still unsteady nose working the air. When he reached Ryan's hand, he paused, then pressed his head into Ryan's palm with surprising trust. Ryan felt his throat tighten. He had trained himself to respond to threats, not tenderness. Yet, this small gesture carried more weight than any commendation he had ever received. Max approached next, lowering himself deliberately, offering calm rather than dominance. The puppy leaned against him, a silent acceptance passing between old protector and new life. Sarah watched from a distance, arms crossed loosely, her expression thoughtful. She had seen this before, not the drama of rescue, but the quieter aftermath when choices mattered most. "He needs a name," she said. Ryan considered it, thinking of the space between breath and breath of things that survived where they should not have. "Hope," he said finally. The word felt right, not as promise, but as direction. As night settled again outside the clinic windows, Ryan signed the preliminary foster paperwork. His name steady on the line. He knew there would be challenges, medical bills slow, healing memories stirred. But he also knew something fundamental had shifted. Some storms left destruction. Others cleared the air enough to see what remained. Ryan rested a hand on Max's head, the other hovering near Hope's fragile warmth, understanding that this chapter was not about rescue anymore. It was about responsibility and the quiet courage to stay. Spring arrived not all at once, but in small permissions. The snow outside the clinic retreated into thin, shining veins along the curb, and the air learned how to smell like soil again. Ryan Walker stood in the parking lot with the early sun warming his face, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of a morning that did not demand vigilance. Max waited patiently at his side leash, slack posture relaxed in a way that only came when a place felt safe. Inside the carrier, Hope, now stronger eyes, brighter, shifted and sighed a sound that once would have been impossible. The drive home took them west toward the foothills, where Ryan's modest house sat at the edge of a pine-lined neighborhood, quiet and unassuming. The house had been chosen years earlier for its distance from noise and people, a refuge for a man who preferred the company of silence. Today the silence felt different, less like an absence, more like room to breathe. Ryan carried Hope inside first, moving slowly, narrating each step as if the puppy understood every word. Hope's coat had deepened into a warm, sable ears, now standing tall with youthful confidence, legs still clumsy but determined. At nearly 3 months old he was small for his breed, yet there was a steadiness in his gaze that hinted at resilience earned early. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived that afternoon for a follow-up visit, her SUV pulling into the driveway with the same calm purpose she brought to emergencies. In daylight, she looked less clinical, more human, tall, athletic chestnut hair, loose around her shoulders, eyes alert but kind. She examined Hope carefully, praising his progress, explaining what the next weeks would require. "Routine," she said, glancing at Ryan with a knowing smile. "Consistency and patience." Ryan listened closely. He had built his life on routines before. This one felt different, gentler. A neighbor wandered over during the visit, drawn by the quiet excitement. His name was Mark Ellison, mid-50s, broad-shouldered with a salt-and-pepper beard and the relaxed confidence of a retired firefighter. Mark's gait favored his left knee, an old injury that had ended his career early, but his smile came easily. He crouched to greet Max first, offering a respectful hand, then admired Hope from a careful distance. "Looks like you've got yourself a crew," he said. Ryan felt a small, unexpected warmth at the word. Weeks passed. Hope learned the geography of the house, the sunlit spot by the window, the water bowl that never ran dry, the yard where pine needles softened his first clumsy runs. Max became his constant shadow, correcting, gently teaching by example rather than force. Ryan watched the bond form with quiet awe. He found himself laughing at small things. Hope's exaggerated sneezes, Max's patient tolerance, the way evenings settled more peacefully than they ever had before. Sleep came easier. Nightmares loosened their grip. Responsibility, he discovered, could be a kind of healing when shared. One morning, Detective Laura Bennett stopped by to deliver final paperwork. In casual clothes, she looked less severe, auburn hair, pulled-back jacket worn soft with use, but her eyes retained their thoughtful depth. She confirmed that Thomas Reed had been charged and that Hope's case would help strengthen protections against similar crimes. "You did more than rescue a dog," she said quietly. "You changed a pattern." Ryan absorbed the words, understanding that impact didn't always announce itself loudly. On a clear Saturday, Ryan took Max and Hope to a small park near the foothills. Families picnicked, children laughed, and the world felt wide but welcoming. Hope trotted forward, tail high, then paused to look back as if checking that Ryan was still there. Ryan smiled and nodded, an unspoken assurance exchanged. When Hope returned and pressed into his leg, Ryan felt something settle into place. This was not the end of a mission. It was the beginning of a life arranged around care rather than conflict. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the grass, Ryan sat between Max and Hope, hands resting where warmth met trust. He thought of how close everything had come to ending before it began, and how a single decision, listening, stopping, staying, had altered the course of 3 lives. Hope curled against him, breathing slow and steady, and Ryan understood that joy did not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it came quietly and asked only that you remain. At the end of this story, we are reminded that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes God's hand moves quietly through a pause, a choice, a heart that listens when others walk past. Hope survived not because the world was kind, but because one man stopped. One dog sensed the truth, and compassion was allowed to act. In our daily lives, we may never open a suitcase at an airport, but we all encounter moments where we can choose mercy over indifference, courage over comfort. Those small decisions, guided by faith, are where God often does His greatest work. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your days with quiet miracles, and may His grace walk beside you and those you love.